welcome to Pyramid Times. We have a very wonderful guest, very special guest with us, Dena Merriam. Dena Merriam began working in the interfaith movement in the late 1990s when she served as vice chair of the Millennium World Peace Summit of Religions and Spiritual Leaders held at the United Nations in New York in the year 2000. She subsequently convened a meeting of women religious and spiritual leaders at the Palace des Nations in Geneva, and from that gathering founded the Global Peace Initiative of Women in 2002. In 2008, Miss Merriam was one of the founding members of the Contemplative Alliance, which later became a program of GPIW. For over 40 years, Dena Merriam has been the student of Paramhamsa Yogananda and a practitioner of Kriya Yoga meditation. Mrs. Merriam received her master's degree from Columbia University. In 2014, she received the Nivano Peace Prize for her interfaith peace efforts. She is the author of the book My Journey Through Time, a spiritual memoir of life, death and rebirth, the untold story of Sita, and when the bright moon rises. This is really going to be released in the month of January 20. And today's topic is going to be on the untold story of Sita, the book interview. Well, with this, I welcome Dena Merriam to the show. Welcome, Dena.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So this book has becoming a revolutionary. The way people think about Sita and Rama has been changing because of the arrival of your book. And so where did you get all this information and how did you get this different perspective apart from the traditional Ramayana?
Well, I first read the Ramayana when I was a young woman in my early 20s. I had just started to meditate. And I immediately recognized myself as a devotee of Sri Ram and Mata Sita. But, and of course, I loved the way the story was told, but it seemed to me to be only part of the story. And of course, I didn't believe the ending of that of the Valmiki Ramayana, which I later learned was an addition much after the book was written. So to me, it was like a half-told story. And but I didn't know how to access the rest of the story. You know, there was so much I wanted to know about Sita that wasn't in there. And then as I got older and my meditation practice developed, I began having many very intense experiences of past life recall, which I wrote about in my book, Journey Through Time. And this happened to me over a period of 10, 20 years where I would find myself back in time, reliving one life and then another. And then I suddenly saw these amazing karmic patterns of cause and effect. One life leads into the next and leads into the next. And it was, and I attributed it to my serious meditation practice. It was a revelation. And so I was going through these experiences when I took a trip to Ayodhya a few years ago. I had already written my book and I thought, well, okay, I've gone back 7 lives. I've seen everything I'm going to see. You know, let me put that aside. And I took a trip to Ayodhya, and then I went to Vaishno Devi, which is a very powerful shrine. I've always had very great blessings from pilgrimages. I've gone to Badrinath 3 times and Kedarnath and Gangotri, and I always had something deep happen to me on the inner plane after such a journey. But Vaishno Devi, it was very crowded. Oh, millions of people. It was hot. And I didn't feel, but somebody actually came and took us to the head of a very long line. We were able to stand there at the shrine. And I didn't feel anything for that moment because I was distracted by all the crowds. And then the next day, this was in Jammu. Someone took us, we went to a Raghunath temple. And there I had this very powerful experience of a child sitting before, standing before Sri Ram. And I mean, this was further back in time than I had ever imagined. And so one thing led to another. And for the next several months, I was back living that era as the servant in that household. And, whether I was actually that servant or whether that servant was speaking through me, I can't know. All I know is that I was living that life, hearing the things really lifted into another reality where I was living among those people. And and I just recorded what I saw and heard, and the process. I went through a transformation, and I realized that Sita was teaching me through writing this book. She was teaching me. She was showing me her ever living presence, and that I could attune myself with her and feel her guidance in my life. So there were many things that happened to me in the process of writing the book, and most especially was catching a glimpse of this overwhelming love that Sri Ram and Sita brought to earth.
That's so amazing. And how was your first vision of Sita?
How was the first vision of Sita?
Yes.
Well, I first, as I went back in time, I first saw her as a child, and actually, even before I saw Sita, it was Janak Baba who had a great impact on me, and it awakened such love, and I realized what an important role he played in the whole unfolding. He's was not a background character. He was a major force, and there was a reason why Sita took birth under him. It was the knowledge kingdom, whereas Ayodhya was the center of power, and he recognized the need to bring together the knowledge and the power. And so it was my first experience was of Janak Baba.
That's so amazing. In general, in the current society, also it's mostly male dominated, and all the gurus we have are also males. Maybe very few are females. But how did you highlight Sita's importance? We have all the while been hearing of only that Rama is great and never heard about Sita.
I
And
think it's because that that the story of Ram and Sita for many millennia was told orally. Valmiki, it was written down much later after the time, and it was the descending Treta Yuga when that came. So there was still a time when the women sages were very prominent, and so as they go through the forest, Sita encounters many of the women sages, and they have come down to us now as like Anasuya. How is Anasuya known? She's not known as Sage Anasuya. She's the wife of, and all of these, Arundhati is the wife of. They're all known as the wives, not for their own spiritual contributions, but it wasn't like that then. At the time that Sita lived, the women were very active in shaping the world and played as much of a role as their male counterparts. But over time, as the yugas descended, the patriarchy took hold of the narrative, and that's why the narrative is centered around Ram and not Sita, when actually they were perfectly balanced. Because in the Treta Yuga, there was a balance between the male and the female energies. You can see that in just the fact that for the first time in all of the incarnations of Narayan, he has Narayani with him as an equal partner. And so it's the declining times that have shaped the story that has come to us. And so it was shaped through a patriarchal lens. But we're now moving into the upward cycle of the Yuga cycles. And so now it's time to move out of that and to recapture the essence of that narrative, which is the balance of the male and female energies.
that's so nice. All these days, I have been hearing about returning of the goddess also. Can you emphasize on the importance of the feminine qualities or the goddess energies that are coming onto this planet?
Well, as we emerge from several thousand years of kind of a loss of spiritual knowledge, where the Shakti has become has retreated, so to speak, or we've covered it up, hidden it up, and created a lot of imbalances in the world. You see that most especially now with what's happening with all the life forms on Earth, all the species going extinct, all the pollution, because there's been this imbalance. The imbalances are manifesting themselves in so many ways on the Earth. And so it's critical now, and I think that part of our work now is to reclaim that divine feminine energy, is bring the Shakti back to do her work, which is often done on the inner planes in subtle ways. And you can see a lot of Sita's work was on the inner plane. It wasn't in the outer battle; it was on the inner battle when she entered Ravana's kingdom. And this is a story that's as true today as it was then. She was working with him on the interior plane to bring out some of his repressed anger and all of the negative energies that had entered him. And then Ram came on the outer field, and together they were able to transform that energy.
That's so amazing. You have been saying in the book that there is a curse on Ravana and which has created this whole of Ramayana. Can you emphasize on that?
The curse?
Yes. And how the Ramayana got created.
Well, there were several curses that were uttered because at that time, that's how the laws of karma were activated. The sages were able to activate those specific cause-effect relationships. So this story begins in the subtle world of Vaikuntha, in that very high celestial plane, where this being, who we know as Ravana, but who had been known as Jaya, had not yet reached the level of selflessness and purity to enter there. But he was a devoted attendant, and so he was allowed to enter. And of course, his remnants of his desires and lust followed him to that plane, and begin to cause disruptions. And Narayan knew that he had to go back into the physical world to work out these remnants of the negative emotions. And so it was enacted out through this drama with the sages who he challenged, that he was to be sent to Earth and that he could do it in 3 lifetimes, but they would be very intense lifetimes, and he would really he would resist Narayan, and Narayan would have to free him. And so Ravana was the second of those 3 lifetimes. But it shows, as I learned this story, because I vaguely had heard of it, but I didn't really understand it. So the process for me, in the process, I came to understand these narratives that have been simplified for us. You know, the way the story comes down, the 4 sages want to visit Narayan, but the gatekeeper says, no, you can't. That's very much of a simplification of the story. It was the fact that Ravana had not yet reached the level of advancement where he really could live in that world without causing disruption. And so I realized, one, these celestial worlds have a reality of their own, and they're very much affected by what happens here, and we're very much affected by what happens there. And so they're very much integrated, actually. And, as we live our earth life, we rarely are conscious of what's taking place in the higher planes. We might call them, in today's scientific world, other dimensions, subtler dimensions of reality. And yet they are things are happening in those realms that we are not aware of, yet are affecting us. And so with so many of these stories, I think one of the most eye-opening stories for me was the story of Sage Ahilia, because the way that story is told is very, very different in the conventional narrative. And so I began to feel that a lot of my work was correcting many of these stories about the women sages who had been cast into the shadows. And that if we are going to rebalance our world, we have to retell the stories and bring them out of the shadows.
That's so amazing. And Sita been to Lanka, and what is her contribution during her stay over there?
In Lanka,
Yes,
well, she was able to release much of the negative karma because it wasn't just Ravana. Many of the people under his command, the warriors, had committed atrocities, and so much of the wealth had been stolen. Lanka was a very wealthy place, but many of the resources, we see this playing out in our world today. I mean, the story repeats itself. Many of the resources of other lands had been taken to build the wealth of Lanka. And there was much karmic debt. And Sita was not only able to help release some of the negative energies within Ravan, but through the land. And that's why she drew upon Mandodari. And actually, there's a whole story about Sujata in writing the Rukmini book, which I'm doing now, which is a sequel, because Sita Narayani took rebirth as Rukmini, and I'm seeing again many of the stories about Sita from a later perspective. And there's a whole story around Sajita, who was the woman who took care of Sita when she was in the garden, was said to be Vibhishan's daughter, and was sent specifically to guard Sita. There's a whole later story about her, which I won't reveal right now. But there were many things that took place in Lanka that needed Sita's presence to be there.
that's so nice of handling the negative karma that has been accumulated in that place and releasing of all that. And
This, we just add something. This that ancient story of when the negative energies were released during the early formation of the universe. Lord Shiva took into himself a lot of that negative energy. This is the work of the Mahadevas, the great devas, is to continually neutralize, because the whole karmic law it's not a law of reward and punishment. It's a law of rebalancing the universe. The universe is always, and that's Narayana and Narayani, the rebalancing principle. And so a lot of the negative energies have to be neutralized or absorbed so that this balance is maintained and the universe can continue its expansion and growth.
that's so nice. I'm going to the actual life of Sita. She was born in a Janak family. And can you share the relationship with the father and how the kingdom has been in harmony and peace, and what are the things around?
Well, Janak, because it was not a powerful kingdom, they didn't have a military. Janak Baba had engaged in many years of very intense sadhana and received the blessings of many sages. Actually, there's a story that I heard once that a man wanted to become a king. He wanted to be a noble king, but before he became a king, he took birth in that kingdom as a poor beggar. And then he took a second birth as a struggling farmer. And then he took a third birth in the kingdom. And in this way, he understood the plight of the people. And he was able, when he finally took birth as the king, he was able then to really serve the needs of the people. Well, I don't know much about Janak Baba's previous births, but I do know that in his life, he knew all of the families. I mean, think of that achievement. Even though it was a small kingdom, there were, tens of thousands of families, and yet he was able to tune in to the needs of all. There was no hunger, there was no lack. They led a simple life. It was not one of extravagance. The wealth was very much one of wisdom rather than material possessions. And he had been praying for Sita's birth. And so when she appeared, and the story is, that she was the daughter of the earth. And the way I see it, she was a self-manifesting one. She self-manifested. She just appeared, and she appeared in the earth. It was as if the earth carried her into the physical realm. The Devi of the earth carried her into the physical realm. And there was a very, very deep bond between them. And of course, he appeared to her many times later, after she had left Mithila. And to me, one of the most touching things is that Sita's love for all the people of Mithila never left her. Her love for the servants. And later on, when I saw in her life as Rukmini, she brings back to her many of the citizens who had been in Mithila around her, because she had committed herself to helping them step by step on their journey home. And so there was this very deep bond between not only her and her father, but all of the people of the kingdom.
That's so nice. And in the book, you have mentioned many situations where she was in deep communion with nature. She was able to connect to the animals, plants, and even the people in the kingdom. If they suffered anything, she used to just get the insights from nature and support the people over there. Can you explain more of her healing abilities or the care that she gave to others?
We have to remember that this was during the Treta Yuga. Treta Yuga was not like our Yuga. It was very different. And so if you think about what the consciousness was, during the Satya Yuga, the film between the material and spiritual world was very thin, and so you could see spiritual energies. You could see the devas and the devis. There was this interaction between the spiritual material worlds. There was very little focus on outer development because the focus was on living in the higher spiritual plane. In the Treta Yuga, that was declining. Also, so there's both a cyclical and a linear evolution. So during the Treta Yuga was also a time of separation from the natural world. In the higher ages, there was no separation. There was no well-established ego consciousness where there was desire for more and more. There was no warfare because there was no wanting what somebody else had. People lived very harmoniously with the earth. They took what they needed to sustain their bodies. Their wealth was the beauty of the natural world. There was an abundance. And so in the declining ages, as the Treta Yuga began to descend, this oneness with the natural world was being lost. And people were focusing on the development of the outer world. And the ego consciousness was developing of my wants rather than what's for the collective good. So that's one of the reasons that Ram and Sita, I came during this time, I think. It was not just about Ravan, although Ravan was seeding this development of the inflated ego. But they knew the dangers that this inflated ego would lead to, which we see today. A destruction of the earth because of our consumption, human greed beyond what it had ever been, with people having $100 billion. You couldn't spend it over many, many lifetimes. Human greed and selfishness has really reached its epitome, and we now are going to be forced to move beyond that. But at Ram and Sita's time, this was just taking hold of the human consciousness. And so there were many things that they wanted to seed into the human mind. One of them was the love for nature. Because once you move out of the oneness with nature, then nature just becomes commodity, there for your use. Also, care for other humans, because in this consciousness of oneness, you don't see your own needs as separate from theirs. So you don't take more for yourself because you understand that you're part of a greater whole. So this is the consciousness we have to regain today as we're moving into the higher part, into the part of the rising part of the cycle, to regain the sense of unity, of oneness as part of the whole, not just the human family, but the entire family of life.
That's so nice. And also in one of the incident which I was got awestruck by the narration you have given, like God and goddesses are coming to Sita for a discussion when she decided to ascend to a different dimension. Can you describe around the event?
That's the apex of the story, is that Sita, being who she was, Narayani, Ram, out of his love for her, had to make it a great celebration. And so Narayan and Narayani are not just greatly loved by the humans and animal forms, but by all the different dimensions of life, because they maintain the balance in all of the worlds, and without which there would be destruction. And so, Ram wanted to celebrate their union and to imprint their union in the minds of all for millennia to come. And so he called all the Devis there and the Devas, all those who had who knew who Sita was, and it was that moment where whenever there's I write about this a little bit in When the Bright Moon Rises. Whenever there's a celestial marriage or celestial union, we call it marriage. We don't really know what that means in the higher dimensions. But when there is such a union, an intense force of love is emitted into the universe. Depending on what level these celestials are, if they're the higher celestials, it really spreads throughout the three worlds. And so what Ram was doing was creating the occasion where their love could be there could be a burst throughout the worlds of this love that they had awakened, and it was to last. I mean, that, when we think of Ram today or Sita, we feel it in our heart. We might feel just a bit of it, a small taste of it, but that's a piece of the divine love that they continually emit. And it wasn't just a moment in time, it's a continual fusion of love. And that was the purpose. And that was how Sita regained her celestial form, or returned to her celestial form.
So many times in the book, you have also mentioned how Sita was sensitive to Ram's energy even without meeting them in the physical reality. So, is it only possible for celestial people like Sita and Rama, or even we can also become aware of our divine partner or divine purposes that we have in this life?
We are divine beings. We think ourselves to be human. We dream ourselves to be human. But what Sita's work is to awaken in us the memory of our divine nature. That is her work. And if you look in Earth time, it happens over a long period of time through many incarnations. But there is no time really. We can live in that awareness now at the moment, but we cover ourselves with dreams. We enclose ourselves with dreams of our physical of identification with our physical body. But we can live in that celestial world. I mean, in some of my other books, I talk about the time between lives on Earth in a subtler dimension. And just as time is not a reality in the true sense, so space is not. We exist, we are omnipresent and omniscient, but again, we enclose ourselves in this limited form. But we can access those higher dimensions. And for me, it's a very personal thing. It's through meditation. I learned that lesson when I was very young. Meditate, meditate, meditate. Whatever you do in life, stick with your meditation, because that is the way to awaken to your true nature. And it may not happen in this life, depending on the intensity of one's effort and desire. But I attribute all my experiences through my committed meditation practice. And so we can access those higher dimensions. It's a matter of fine tuning. It's like a radio. You turn the dial of a radio and it could be very, very fuzzy, but then you tune into a station and it's very clear. So we have to fine tune the radio of our heart or of our mind so that we can tune into these higher dimensions. And it's the same thing with aligning ourselves with the presence of Sri Ram. There are times during the day where suddenly I feel I'm in a very intense alignment with Sri Ram. I feel his presence. And I mean, to me, what can you say? I don't live in that all the time. It's just moments that I'll feel Sita or Ram's presence very intensely. And that's how I know that they are moment to moment guiding those who turn to them. Those who attune themselves with that vibration can very much feel their presence.
That's so nice how you have been switching across the dimensions. Maybe it could be your own past lives, or you would have channeled the life of the Soma and Meenakshi, all these characters you have mentioned in the book. That's so wonderful.